Hi guys, so Maggie here from Knitting in the Park. Today's video is going to be about yarn. Might sound like a short video, but there's a lot of different things, pieces of information to take into consider when choosing your yarn. Where do you buy your yarn, right? There are a couple different options. You can go online. There's a lot of different stores online. One of my favorites online is Paintbox. You can buy this from loveknitting.com. Paintbox is a really soft acrylic blend. It's a really forgiving yarn, especially for beginners. So I really like this. It's a worsted weight, so it knits up quickly. You can go to big box stores, so like your big box craft stores, Michael's and Joann's if you're based in the US like me. And you can also go to your local yarn stores. If you're new to knitting, do yourself a favor and go, do a Google search, go find your local yarn store. You're going to find a friendly face, for the most part, and a repository of information. So you're going to not just be able to find the yarn, generally the needle, and all of the advice that you might need to complete your first project. You might make a few friends along the way. So I highly suggest checking out your local yarn store. When choosing your yarn, there's a few different things that we're going to take a look at to consider. The first is fiber content. Generally, how soft and how forgiving is the fiber that you're going to use, not just to work with, but to care afterwards. So once you make that scarf, can you machine wash it? Can you dry it? Or do you have to lay it out and literally pin it in place and block it? So something to consider there. So that's fiber content. The next size is the weight or the thickness of an individual strand of that yarn. So the thicker the yarn, the faster it knits up. The thinner the yarn, the more delicate the stitches, the more lighter and airier your work is going to be. It ranges from often lace weights. So these are the really dainty, delicate weights that I maybe like made my wedding shawl out of, all the way up to super bulky, which are the popular ones where you're seeing like those huge, chunky blankets that are like knit this up quick and everything. So a lot of different options here. How do you pick? So let's talk about fiber content. Fiber content, you're going to find yarns that are pure and yarns that are blends. So you'll find your wools. You've got your superwash wools, you've got your merino wools. Each of them have a little bit of a different characteristic to the yarn. My biggest thing is to go and feel the yarn for yourself. It's really hard to tell from a website or just walking through an aisle quickly, grabbing something, how soft or how coarse that yarn is going to be. And then also look at the label, make sure for the wash and care instructions. A silk yarn is extremely delicate and you're going to want to take care when storing it as well. So fiber content dictates a lot. So you've got your wools. A new one on the scene right now is alpaca. Alpaca is becoming very popular because you get the same look and feel as the wools that we are used to or grew up with. But in some places it's cheaper. And depending on the different yarn, it's also sometimes a little bit softer as well. So definitely alpaca is something really fun to play around with. What else do you have? I mentioned your silks. You've got bamboo. Bamboo is often an alternative to those lacy, lightweight yarns. Soft and great to knit with. You've got cotton. Cotton is great for things like dishcloths, dish towels, washcloths, things like that. I've made some baskets out of it and they're hanging in my bathroom for my towel storage. So there's a lot you can do with cotton. And then there's some acrylic, which are artificial or man-made yarns. And like all the ones I mentioned before, there's a range in price and quality when it comes to acrylic. So you have your budget yarns, which are a little bit coarser. I always think of the yarns that my grandmother made crocheted Afghans out of, God rest her soul. They're always kind of itchy and scratchy, all the way on up to some really nice acrylics and acrylic blends. When I talk about blends, you'll often have like a 60-40 or an 80-20 kind of a split between some kind of acrylic like a nylon and a nicer yarn like a wool or a superwash wool, or superwash merino. So there's a lot of different options when it comes to the actual fiber content of the yarn. And then there's even more options when we get into the weight or the thickness of that yarn. So I've grabbed a couple yarns here just to talk quickly through the thickness. I don't have any of the super bulky on me, so you can go Google those for yourself though. Like I mentioned, the paint box yarn, it's a thicker yarn. It's a really nice one to work with. Isn't it a blend? Oh, no, it's 100% acrylic. It's really soft, so while it is a man-made fiber, it's great for hats and scarves and things that are going to be directly against some of your sensitive skin, like your face and your neck. Let's see here. And then a thinner version of this, I have a Knit Picks tweed yarn here, and this is a fingering weight, so it's on the thinner side. The strand is a little bit more delicate here. You can see in the difference comparative to the paint box, which is a little bit thicker. And the reason I'm telling you to go to your local yarn store is they're going to be able to help you find the right needle for the right yarn and find both of which for the right project. And if you don't have a pattern, they'll help you find one, or they might have one on hand, or a recommendation that you can do. Once you find your yarn, if you don't have a local yarn store to give you their advice, you can look on the individual label, and on the individual label, it will just tell you the weight of the yarn, but it's also going to tell you what size needle to use to get a certain result, or so this is your gauge. Gauge is important. There's a lot of knitting jokes about gauge being off by a lot. So you can always test it out and knit a couple rows. And that's what's called swatching, so we'll get into that in a second. But let's say for this yarn from Knit Picks, it's a fingering weight, and they tell me, okay, 7 stitches on a number 1 needle, again, itty bitty baby needle, is going to give me a 1 by 1 inch swatch or square of yarn. So it's not as much important when you're following a pre-made pattern. It becomes much more important when you're looking at designing your own patterns, but it's good to start looking at these different things and familiarizing yourself with this now, so that you're not buying a yarn and getting home and starting to knit a project and you're noticing some air or some holes between your stitches, or maybe it's super tight and really hard to work with on your first project. So let's take a look at another one here. This is another way that yarn can come. This is called a yarn cake. So it's dyed yarn, but the color is it's self-striping. So there's different sections that are dyed in different colors, different color combinations. This one is a medium weight, so it's kind of similar to a worsted weight. So it's like your middle of the scale. If you have like really thin super fine on one end and really chunky bulky yarn on the other, your worsteds or your medium weights are right in the middle, and these are great for beginner projects, especially the self-striping, because you get the color change without having to do anything on your own. You're just knitting through it. It's a good thickness to get the dexterity to learn the muscle memory with your hand as you're knitting. So this one, while the fingering weight recommended a very small size 1 needle, this is recommending a US size 7 needle. And this is going to tell me, so the gauge on this one is a 4 by 4 inch square. And it'll tell me how many stitches. So 20 stitches over 20 rows will give me a 4 by 4 inch square. That's called a swatch. So it's a nice way to just start practicing your knitting and looking at the end result before you actually get to the end result. So a fun exercise I like to do with new knitters is take a couple of different yarns and the same size of a needle and knit, like maybe do 20 stitches and 20 rows, and just play around and see the different shapes or the different thicknesses or the tightness to the stitch. So you'll get to see the different ways that you can start to experiment and play around with yarn and get a feel for the different varieties that are out there too. So you're always welcome to come on over and play with my yarn stash if you want. Another way yarn will often come is called a hank. So you get this lovely little almost looks like one of those braided bread rolls of yarn. And this is a, whereas this is like wound up into a ball that you can knit with. There's no wrapping or unraveling that needs to be done here. These guys require a little bit extra work. You'll often find these type of skeins, these hanks, at a local yarn store. They generally are a little bit more of a premium yarn. Some of them often tend to be hand-dyed yarns. You're going to spend a little bit more money. This skein here, whereas this is probably like $3 or $4 at your local big craft store. This skein here ran me $30. It is a really nice wool. This has been sitting in my yarn stash for almost a year now because I've been waiting for the right project to work with it. But to undo these, you kind of have to like work it and kind of poke the one end, and then you'll notice it unravels into, oh my gosh. Okay, so what do you do with this? If you go to a local yarn store and you fall in love with something like this, I know it's a little steep for your first yarn, you can always ask if they will spin it into a ball of yarn for you, if they'll wind it for you. Otherwise, you can come and do it by hand at home, and I'll hopefully have another video on that soon. But just because it's in a different size and shape, I wouldn't necessarily be afraid or shy away from it, especially if you're talking to an expert at a local yarn store. There are a lot of great yarns out there. I hope you'll have some fun and play around. If you ever have any questions on where to buy a yarn, how to buy a yarn, what a gauge means, what a symbol on a yarn label is, always come back to this video. You can ask me in the questions here, or you can reach me at maggie@knittinginthepark.com. That's Maggie, M-A-G-G-I-E, at knittinginthepark.com, or reach out on one of my social media handles, platforms there. So I hope this was informational. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm excited that you're one step further into your knitting journey, and I'm really excited to be doing this with you. So please subscribe to my channel so that you get all of these videos sent directly to you and you won't miss a beat. And you're always able then to come on and ask me questions or follow up with me after the video. Thanks a lot, guys. I hope you enjoy it.